I spend a significant amount of time on this channel talking about how Chrono Trigger is an amazing game that everyone and their mom should play. And I stand by that notion. I think everyone and their mom should play Chrono Trigger immediately. Do it right now. However, though it seems like a very conclusive experience, Chrono Trigger wasn't the end of the story. Sure, the gang beat the ever-loving shit out of Lavos, but that doesn't mean things ended there for the world of Chrono Trigger. That's right. I'm here to talk about something completely different to Chrono Trigger, and tell you all about the world of the game made after Chrono Trigger, Radical Dreamers, which was a direction that I would never have imagined the story of Chrono Trigger to take. You're probably wondering what the hell I'm talking about. Wasn't Chrono Cross the game after Chrono Trigger? Well, it wasn't. Radical Dreamers was released for a special Nintendo satellite program, so many people in the 90s missed out on it, especially because it was a Japan exclusive service. This has led to all sorts of lost media from this era, but I'm not a lost media channel, so I'm not going to go further into that. Radical Dreamers is preserved in its entirety though. However, all of this explains one thing. Radical Dreamers is obscure as fuck. One of my favorite things about Chrono Trigger is that it honestly has a very open and shut story. The conclusion feels like the natural end to everything in that particular game, with the only loose end really being where Shala is, and I mean, she's probably dead. However, the game's lead writer, Masato Kato, would have disagreed with me on that. Apparently, he thought that the game ended on some unfinished business, so soon enough he set off to work on a sequel. He wrote the main story, which he had decided early on would be much darker than Chrono Trigger. The push for it to be a text-based adventure instead of an RPG definitely helped this darker tone. Yeah, I hadn't mentioned this yet, but Radical Dreamers itself isn't much of a sequel to Chrono Trigger at all in terms of its gameplay. It takes more inspiration from text-based adventure games of the 1980s, where players have to input commands and make choices in order to progress the story. Originally it was going to be a survival adventure title instead, but Masato Kato dropped this idea after Resident Evil came out, because apparently just seeing Resident Evil was enough to scare him away from doing that. After the development of Chrono Trigger, Kato himself was in a really rough place, and that's reflected in a lot of the tone of Radical Dreamers. There isn't as much of a whimsical and comedic atmosphere that appears in other works that Kato has written. The nihilism and pessimistic game world were supposedly reflective of his own state of mind at the time, and Kato really wanted to make this game to make sure that players would follow their own dreams instead of being stuck in a job like his. Hence the title Radical Dreamers. I don't think the game achieves this darker tone very well, but I'll get to that later when I talk about the game. This game was a side project, so it was given a lot of leeway to be as dark and strange as it wanted to be. But with being a side project comes its own pitfalls, and Radical Dreamers was only given a 3-month development cycle. Somehow, this wasn't even the worst it could have been. The original demand from Square was 2 months. Jeez. Despite all of this, and Kato himself feeling rather dissatisfied with the finished project, which he claimed was unfinished, he still thinks that the game itself helped solidify his writing style. I also think this game is absurdly unfinished in many aspects, and if this helps solidify his writing style, then I have to say that I think he's a terrible writer. But that's for later. Part of the reason why the connections to Chrono Trigger in this game are so tenuous are due to this rush development cycle, and it's also probably the reason why the game's writing sucks. Come 1996, the game was revealed as part of Square's lineup of games for Nintendo Satellaview, and then it was never seen again after that. The only way to play the game legitimately now is to somehow find a cartridge that has a copy of it downloaded on it, and even then, it's all in Japanese. Though Kato has been given several offers from Square to re-release Radical Dreamers, and possibly even give it an official English translation, first in the PlayStation port of Chrono Trigger and then in the DS port of Chrono Trigger, he has refused both times because he doesn't think it fits the tone of Chrono Trigger and shouldn't be bundled with it, which I think is kind of bullshit, but whatever. Luckily, playing things legally is always the wrong thing to do. And in April 2003, there was already a complete fan translation ready for us to play. Unfortunately, this first patch had a few glitches like not being able to save and some minor typos, but these were fixed in subsequent versions such as the 2005 patch, which was the 1.4 and final version of the patch. This is the version of the patch we'll be using, though there's also a French version we could use if you don't want me to understand anything that I'm doing when I'm playing the game. Now that you have all the proper context going in, let's talk about Radical Dreamers. So, when you boot up Radical Dreamers and you find out it follows a band of thieves that are aptly named the Radical Dreamers. Serge, the narrator, with no other personality than being attracted to Kid, who is the real main character attached to the story and speaks in a Cockney accent with a brash attitude, and the enigmatic Magil, who is literally the anti-hero Magus from Chrono Trigger wearing a masquerade ball mask. I'm not kidding. Sorry for spoiling it. It's just so silly that I had to throw it out there. His sprites even have the same colors and look like Magus's. When they appear, of course, considering what style of game this is. It makes sense, considering Magus is probably the only character from Chrono Trigger who I would say had a loose end, but still, it's just a very silly part of the game to me. Back to Serge. My god, his narration is so bland. He just constantly spits out a bunch of useless world-building information at you a mile a minute. So many walls of text are delivered from him in this game for no reason other than to just have them. Most of the lore you get from him is nowhere near necessary. You get so much over-explanations of the politics of poor or whatever, and his inexplicable attraction to Kid is just really annoying to read about throughout the course of the game. She's just a really annoying girl, like, what is so attractive about her to Serge? Why does he constantly fixate on her? What is going on here? I feel like I'm missing a key part of the story here as to why he's attracted to Kid so much, because it just doesn't make any sense to me. Speaking of the game, let's talk about its darker tone. And I mean that with the heaviest of quotation marks. Masato Kato really wanted this one to be darker, and there's a much darker overall theming here. You're exploring a haunted mansion where poltergeists and stuff jump out at you or whatever. Overall, it's not really much darker than Chrono Trigger. Also, the rooms are just literally dark. The game is really hard to see because it's just literally a poorly lit game. It has darker window dressing overall, sure, but otherwise it's very silly. You put lipstick on a statue's face, you can accidentally have wacky romance shenanigans with Kid. There's a bunch of sub-scenarios full of nonsense. It's a very silly game that just has some really edgy moments, like brutally describing how you murder cats in your first combat encounter, or how you get bit by piranhas or whatever. I'm not a fan of those. Combat really sucks in this game because it's a text-based adventure game. You select an option and then you read out what happens, and it happens very slowly. It's not engaging at all, and I would have just preferred they omitted combat entirely, especially because there are random encounters in the game. Why? A lot of my issues with this would be fixed if there was a button to make the text scroll faster, but there isn't. So you just have to wait through all of the text until it's totally done, and then continue going on, rinse and repeat. It's honestly really frustrating. This wouldn't be as much of a problem if all of the text was unique, but there are mandatory segments where you have to reread the same text multiple times, such as any time you encounter a poltergeist. Speaking of encounters again, there is no incentive to engaging in combat in this game, and there's also no way to track your hit points. Serge has an invisible HP bar that goes down, and when it reaches 0 you die. You have no way of keeping track of when you're going to die soon, and even if you do, you have no way of mitigating that. All that aside, the game does not signpost when you're going to take damage very well at all. One room seems fine, but then randomly floods with piranhas, for example. I'm not kidding, it's just a normal room, and then it floods with piranhas. You know that funny stone face with the lipstick I mentioned earlier? It can just chomp on your arm a lot, really hurt you. That's not the only thing that this game is very bad at communicating. Progression is just non-existent. You basically spend the entire game clunkily navigating through text menus and going through the same few dark chambers in order to find maybe something. The game doesn't tell you anything. Though I suppose that's just a staple for this kind of game. It's not a very easy place to navigate. It's hard to keep a mental map of, because everything looks the same. These types of games are often saved by their writing, and this one just doesn't have very good writing. Kato says he wanted to be a nihilistic and dark game, and this game is just not super nihilistic or dark. It's a messy attempt at adding more to Chrono Trigger's story, which again was already pretty conclusive as a story. The sub-scenarios are also just really weird, featuring the gross kid gets punished for rejecting sexual harassment and mecha anime fight with the main villain Lynx. Those weren't written by Kato himself, so it makes sense that they suck, but it's still something that I think the game would have been better off just not including. Kato thought they were necessary to balance out the tone, but there's enough comedy, or, well, quote-unquote comedy, in the main game anyway. Plus, a good chunk of the writing in this game is again just explaining world-building stuff, or Kid just generally being an annoying character and Serge going awooga at that. It's not great. Like, again, with the stone face, Kid, pulls out her personal affects, and you have to put one of them inside it. And the entire time, Serge is like, wowza, Kid is really hot. And none of the objects that you have on you will work. So you might have to fumble through tons of text just to get through this one section to find out, oh, nothing you have is going to work anyway. And all for what? Just a bunch of silly scenes that aren't even that funny, like putting lipstick on the face, or almost losing a pill bug inside it, or having the face lick you because you used a fishing line for some reason. And Kid the entire time is just a complete ass about it, and generally just yells at you for not being able to figure out a puzzle that you didn't have the capacity to figure out anyway. It's not great. I think the biggest indicator of Radical Dreamer's lack of quality is that for this review I couldn't even really bring myself to finish it. It's just not a fun game to play, and there are some great games that aren't fun to play, like Doshin the Giant. I just don't think this particular game was trying to be that. It's supposed to be this dark and compelling story that's engaging to unravel. But when I think of Radical Dreamers, I think of going through cramped and dark hallways with bad comedic writings and attempts at edgy descriptions with random encounters thrown in for suspense in a system that's not built for combat. If I were Square, I would have simply not released the game at all. I can't think of any redeeming qualities to it, and Kato was right to call it unfinished. Maybe next time, Square, don't crunch your workers with a deadline of 2 months and then barter it up to 3. That doesn't sound like a recipe for a good game, especially one this ambitious. This has been Arc Agent Everlasting, Radical Dreamer, signing off. Thank you for watching.